I'm Margot Beasley. I'm chair of the Blackheath History Forum. First, I'd like to say that Blackheath is located in the country of the Darug and Gundungurra peoples, and the Blackheath History Forum recognises that Darug and Gundungurra traditional owners have a continuous and deep connection to their country, and that this is of great cultural significance to Aboriginal people, both locally and in the region. So we pay our respects to elders past and present and recognise the strength, capacity and resilience of past and present Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Blue Mountains region. Okay, so welcome to everyone who's tuned in today. This is the fourth in the Blackheath History Forum's 2020 season of online presentations. I'm very delighted to welcome Professor David Walker today, who, amongst the many academic positions he's held, was the inaugural chair of Australian Studies at Peking University. He is currently an Alfred Deakin Professor at Deakin University. So today, David's going to be talking about the history of Australia's responses to a rising Asia from the 19th century onwards. He's published very widely in this field and will talk in particular about two histories he's written. The first was titled Anxious Nation, that's us, Australia, and the most recent history was titled Stranded Nation, White Australia in an Asian Region. They're both very entertaining and highly readable histories, so I commend them to you for anyone who's interested in Australia's relationships with Asia, China in particular, I guess, but not just China. And pick them up. They make some very interesting reading, full of interesting anecdotes and hilarious tales. Just one quick reminder that we welcome questions after the talk. Please check at the top of the 2020 page on the History Forum's website for how to post a question when the talk is over. The talk will go for about 50 minutes and then we'll go to questions, perhaps for half an hour or so. We'll just see how it all works out. So, David Walker, thank you very much, and over to you.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you very much. And thank you, Blackheath History Forum. We Victorians would dearly love to be there, but we know we're most unwelcome outside of Victoria, so perhaps another time. But it's a great opportunity to talk to you, and thank you for the invitation. So we're talking about from Anxious Nation to Stranded Nation and whatever happened. So I'll offer an overview of Australian responses to Asia from the late 19th century. And Anxious Nation begins the story, and I want to go to, first of all, the question of why the anxiety, what was the sources of the anxiety. And I want you to look very closely at that image and see tropicality, rainforests, and all the rest of it. Part of the concern about how Australia would meet rising Asia in the late 19th century goes to the question of how race and climate was discussed in the late 19th century. And broadly speaking, the idea was that the stronger races, the more capable races, were raised in cold climates. Cold climates required them to plan ahead, to think how they were going to get through winter. That, according to these theories, also produced bigger brains because they had to plan. And big brains are, of course, very desirable. And it also meant that the planning and world-conquering capacities of the Anglo-Saxons were particularly evident given our British race background and our cold climate background. But in the tropics, all people had to do was sit under a palm tree, wait for a coconut to land in their lap. And basically that encouraged, again, according to these theories, lassitude, laziness. It didn't require a big brain to sit under a palm tree. It didn't require much planning because there were no arduous winters or difficult winters to survive. So the argument was that you had two different sets of racial capacities, at least two, indeed more, but at least two based around climate. So the question then arose, what happens when you take a cold climate people, the Anglo-Saxon race, and plant them in a new continent, which was appreciably warmer? And cutting to the chase of this argument, the fear was that white Australian settlers would degenerate in the hotter climate of Australia, and they'd be particularly unsuited to tropical Australia. So the fear was that you'd have a root stock of Britishers who had, remarkable adaptive capacities and colonizing aptitudes and so on, who would be increasingly unsuited to the settlement of the Australian continent. So that race and climate fear led, as I would argue, to certain anxieties about racial degeneration, incapacity, and a people not as fit as their forebears to settle the continent. Now, the next concern, which is not unrelated to the first, goes to the question of the Australian city to urbanisation and to patterns of settlement. Because it soon became apparent that while Australians had available to them a large and, in the language of the day, empty continent, they were not choosing to settle there. And by the 1890s, Australia was being written of, spoken of, referred to as a precociously urban society. And that seemed a tremendous paradox, really, because you've got this entire continent, you've got a land available for settlement, but these people are gathering in coastal cities. Now, part of the argument around why they were doing that goes back to point one, racial degeneration, that they were poorly equipped to settle the continent. They didn't have the sturdiness, the valour, the courage, the enterprise to do what was required of them, and they huddled in their coastal cities. Of course, we know now, looking at it historically, that the coastal cities of Australia made good economic sense. We had an import-export oriented economy. The coastal city was the logical place for settlement. Pastoral Australia was a low labour force kind of set of industry, whereas the labour demand was much more concentrated in the coastal cities. So the coastal cities actually made all kinds of sense in the Australian circumstance, but they were judged to be another sign of Australia's incapacity, if you like. And city people were also thought to be much more or much less well equipped to defend the continent than rural folks. They weren't good with rifles. They didn't know the country. They were not a good potential guerrilla force. They huddled around there talking and chatting, but they were not much good at the hard task of defending a continent. Now, the third set of concerns after this climate and urbanisation anxiety was the sheer numbers relating to Australian settlement. In 1900, there were about 4 million white Australians, give or take. When they looked north, they saw 400 million Chinese. The numbers didn't look too good. The other concern around population related to the expectations of how many people you could fit into the Australian continent. And in the late 19th century, there were many comparisons made between the size of the Australian continent and the size of the US, roughly comparable. And the feeling was that Australia could have a population and should have a population roughly equivalent to that of the US, and it should have a future roughly equivalent to that of the US as well, that a large population lent status and importance to the to Australia's prospects. So the 4 million people in Australia after over a century of colonisation look like a colonising failure rather than a roaring success. But it also casts doubt upon the, if you like, the moral authority or the moral appropriateness of 4 million white settlers who appeared not to be doing terribly much to settle and develop their continent. What right did they have to occupy an entire continent when so many nations to their immediate north were overcrowded, suffering poverty, and in need of, so it was thought, of land for development? So Empty Australia posed a whole bunch of questions about whether these white Australians were simply taking a dog in the manger attitude towards their continent and saying, well, we're not much prepared to do anything with it ourselves, but we're not too prepared for you to come in and do much better either. So there was that set of arguments raised around emptiness, along with the question of how do you actually defend a continent with so few people. So those three factors, I think, were sitting behind a lot of the concerns about Australia's place in the region, and go to why I chose to call Anxious Nation, Anxious Nation. I wasn't wanting to suggest a nation that was pathologically fearful or frothing at the mouth. I was wanting to suggest that there were some understandable, historically framed concerns that white Australian settlers in the late 19th century had about their place in the region, and especially when they knew they were so far away from the motherland. Now that led to, from the 1880s, some speculation around Asian invasion, which I also look at in Anxious Nation. And this theme really gets going around about the mid to late 1880s. The first substantial serialised story around this theme is William Lane's White or Yellow, a story of the race war of AD 1908. Typically, these stories, as in Lane, set Australia's calamitous future a generation hence. So 1908 is when it's all going to happen. 1888 is when the warning comes. So the idea is that Australia is on a perilous course. There are too many Chinese entering Australia. And in Lane's story, British imperial and economic interests are going to line up with Chinese entrepreneurs to basically settle Queensland and turn it into a Eurasian colony. And of course, sturdy patriots, farmers, workers and others rise up to defend white Australia. And after a hell of a battle, they are ultimately successful. But a lot of blood is shed, and Brisbane looks a bit of a mess at the end of it. But the good people win out over the forces of evil. Now, with the invasion story, I think it's kind of interesting. I won't go into this in huge detail, but at one level, you can look at the invasion story as evidence, or posit the invasion story as evidence of Australians being fearful of Asia, and some historians have done that. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think there are a couple of other things going on. Writers need dramatic tales, and the kind of maiden in distress tale is a great one, but so too is a nation in peril. And a lot of the old bushranger, settler, explorer themes are beginning to peter out in the 1890s. So the idea that Australia might be overrun by the Yellow Peril has certain attractions for writers wanting a dramatic theme. And you could still have, as in Kenneth Mackay's The Yellow Wave, a romantic theme running through it. The romance of the Asiatic invasion of Australia is his subtitle. So you've got this narrative, exciting narrative, dramatic story, a kind of cliffhanger plot, and so on, which is attractive, and writers need that. One of the other themes that runs through these stories, and it's there in The Yellow Wave, is that Australians actually need invasion stories because they need a bit of a boot up the bottom on this subject, because they're a bit complacent. And as much as you might warn them about rising Asia or the Yellow Peril or the danger they're in, or the 400 million Chinese to their north, or the poverty and the disadvantage to their north, they're very, very easily distracted by sport, or along comes the Melbourne Cup, and they're all very interested in that. So one of the other themes running through the invasion story is that these people are pretty hard to wake up. They're in real danger, but are they taking any notice of it? So interpreting those stories for a historian is an interesting exercise, I think, because there are a number of interpretative factors at play in how we might care to read these texts. But there are a number of them from the 1880s down to 1914. Now, you'll all have to read Henry Lawson's poem, so please read it. Please behave. Please do your homework. Now, the names that I've mentioned, Kenneth Mackay, William Lane, Roydhouse, and others who wrote invasion stories are now fairly obscure names. You know, they're not household names. But so the question might arise, you know, is any of this anything other than pretty marginal writing around the theme of invasion? I would argue actually that if you go to Henry Lawson's, not to his short stories, which are different, but if you go to Lawson's poetry, this theme of Australia's danger from Asia, the danger of rising Asia, the danger of racial contamination, of violation, sexual violation, all of these themes are rife in much of Henry Lawson's poetry, particularly in that late 1890s down to 1914 period. And Lawson, as we all know, is the national bard, very popular. His poetry was popular. His writing was popular. You'll see, I think, from that poem that he capitalises Bushman, because the Bushman is seen by him as the race patriot who will defend white Australia from Asian invasion. And again, one of my arguments is that the Bush theme, which has been much written about by historians, has often been taken out of its late 19th century rising Asia context. And in Lawson, it is absolutely unmistakable that the Bushman is the race patriot who will defend white Australia from Asian invasion. So the valorisation of the Bush and the Bushman, I think, is closely related to the rise of Asia through the 1880s and onwards. There are other reasons for people being interested in the Bush, but that is absolutely one of them, in my view. So Henry is an interesting figure there. Also, coming up in the first decade or so of the new century, 1913, in fact, is the figure of Dr. Fu Manchu, not an Australian creation, although there were Australian precursors for the Asian mastermind, but Sax Roma, pseudonym, creates Dr. Fu Manchu in 1913, and he has tremendous longevity, both through the novels, but also in films. So you're still having films come out in the late 1960s and early 1970s, created around the Fu Manchu theme. Now, there are certain attributes of Fu Manchu which are particularly worrying, and I don't want to scare people in Blackheath unduly, but he had a very, very big brain, big Chinese brain, which is perhaps the worst kind of big brain, equivalent to the best 3 minds in the British world, according to one of his British adversaries. So huge intellect. He was a doctor, and the doctor related to medical expertise. But Dr. Fu Manchu didn't turn his medical expertise to humanitarian ends like Dr. Sanjay Gupta on CNN. He wanted world conquest. He wanted to use medical skills and medical experimentation to aid and abet his march towards world conquest. So it's for that reason, and partly, of course, to very opportunistically tie Dr. Fu Manchu to the current pandemic, that I call him a bioterrorist. But I think there's a pretty clear explanation and rhetoric running through the Fu Manchu novels, which says that medical expertise, medical knowledge, scientific knowledge under the auspices of a Dr. Fu Manchu will be brilliantly exploited for the purposes of world conquest. So Fu Manchu sits in the background of these stories, and their impersonators. Fu Manchu impersonators appear in Australia and are pretty popular as an entertainment in the 1920s and 30s. And those novels were also very popular, as were the films in Australia. Now, I run a bit of a counter narrative through Anxious Nation, which says that, okay, there's a fair bit of anxiety, there's a fair bit of concern, there was apprehension about how well equipped Australia was to face and resist rising Asia. But there are also people who are arguing that Australia is, in a sense, well placed to take advantage of the emerging markets of Asia, and these arguments are appearing in the 1890s and early 1900s. The colonies send trade commissioners into the region. There are people who are arguing that trade with Asia will become of major importance, major economic importance to Australia. One prophet before the First World War offers the suggestion that Japan would become Australia's major trading partner. Not a bad prediction for 1910. So the other part of the story is those who are definitely in a minority, I think, but we're laying the groundwork for a narrative, for a story about engagement and connection that our society and our culture could later draw upon when we wanted to distance ourselves from the yellow peril, different understandings, different ways of thinking about our place in the region. So minority voices, but I think important in establishing a vocabulary of engagement and connection that we would later need and draw upon in the latter parts of the 20th century. Okay, we now get to Stranded Nation, which has about 3 sections, not about 3 sections, has 3 sections, is divided into 3 sections. So I'll say something about each of those sections. I'll also look at my watch to see how I'm going. Oh, not too badly. All right. So Stranded Nation. let's progress to the first section, which is Pacific imaginaries. From the 1930s, there were people beginning to feel that Australia had to rethink its place in the region. There were quite a few Pan-Pacific movements developing in the 1920s and 30s, quite a bit of discussion around regional connection. There was also a sense, I think, that Australia could not persist with a singular narrative of threatening Asia, could not continue to simply worry about what Asia was going to do to us and how we might be victimized by predatory Asia or invasive Asia. We had to see ways in which our place in the region could be of some benefit or advantage to us. Part of the rationale for that argument, I think, was that Australian leaders at the time, Australian intellectuals, some people in politics, were beginning to feel that Australia had an opportunity to have a seat at the big table, that if we could say something worthwhile about the region in which Australia was located, we'd be of more interest and more value to the United Kingdom and to the United States than simply as an outpost of empire. So part of the rationale, I think, for trying to come up with a different set of arguments about Australia's place in the Pacific, as it was then largely referred to, was to, in a sense, talk up a bigger role for Australia on the international stage, so that we'd have something of value to say to the United Kingdom and the US, who were more removed from the region. Now, one of the figures I look at in this section, and it has about 5 chapters, each of them have about 5 chapters, is the popular writer Frank Clune. And Clune's pretty interesting figure, I think. He's not much interested in literature with a capital L. In fact, he's not interested in literature with a capital L at all. Clune is trained as an accountant, and he sees writing as a way of making a dollar. So he's not interested in literary fame or high praise from the critics. He wants books that are going to sell and make money for Frank Clune. So Clune comes along in the 1930s, and as I say, always with an eye for the market, always with an eye for the next best thing, the coming thing, hits upon the idea that this Asia is looking a bit interesting, and it's looming a bit larger in our world. So he decides to get on to what he thinks of or sees as a kind of Asian bandwagon and a new set of interests in the region. His first book on Asia-related book, is Sky High to Shanghai, which is published in 1939. And it's also split off into, or he manages to get or secure a number of radio broadcasts on the ABC for his stories. So he's making money out of the ABC. So the great entrepreneur, he sells off his stuff for broadcasting purposes. He also gets various sponsorships. So Qantas, Empire Airways get high praise in Clune's Sky High to Shanghai because they help get him to Shanghai. And various hotels found to be remarkable by Frank Clune, because I'm sure they gave Frank Clune free accommodation. So Clune is the master of sponsorship, the master of getting support, the master of making a dollar. And his writing about Asia continues for pretty close to 20 years, Flight to Formosa being the last of his books. Now, again, you might look at that and think, well, this expresses a pretty clear interest in rising Asia. And up to a point that's true, I think. Clune argued in the books that we needed to see the possibilities of trade with the region, the markets that were emerging in Asia. We needed to take notice of them. we needed to be much more aware of our opportunities in the region. But also in Clune and running through Clune was an idea that I think pervades this Pacific consciousness notion, was not that we were particularly interested in engaging Asia, but Asia was a kind of stage or platform on which Australia could perform both Australianness, but also the white man in Asia, the role of the white man in Asia. And that's pretty strong in all of his novels. So Clune picks up a theme which is expressed elsewhere through the 30s and into the 40s, that Australia has a big role to play in the region, that we are a white nation, we have authority and capacity for governance, we're a bit smarter and cleverer than the coloured people around us. So this is a good stage for us to present our wares. So the Clune novels are both a statement about how we need to be aware of the region, but also a statement about how terrific we are, how great white Australia is. And hearkening back to some of those attributes, those racial attributes, which were said to inhabit the British race. So British race patriotism is a pretty strong theme running through the Clune novels. And wherever he meets in the Second World War, wherever he meets a British general, they all have piercing blue eyes and firm handshakes, independent of whether they had either. So this kind of racialised language of British imperial prowess and Australia's proud role in working with Britain to save this part of the world is persistent through the stories. But increasingly in the 1950s, Clune is really troubled by Asian decolonisation, which gains momentum from the late 1940s. The Asian world is no longer under European control, which is exactly where he wants it to be. So independent Asia is both an alarming and morally troubling development for Frank Clune. And the last story is really an account of how desperate the plight of the white man is in a world of Asian decolonisation. So I kind of end the chapter with an observation that, in fact, the Clune stories are not really prophetic predictions about Australia's increasing role in an Asian world, but they're kind of obituaries, if you like, for the disappearing British imperial world. And that world for Clune is gone or going by the 1950s, and he laments its departure very, very deeply. So that, effectively is the end of Asia for Frank Clune. The second theme of the book I call Volatile Minds. Volatile Minds. And the core argument here is that with Asian decolonisation, as I say, gaining momentum from the late 1940s into the 50s, the Europeans who were controlling the Asian world, the Dutch in Netherlands, East Indies, for example, had gone, and Australia was now surrounded by independent Asian nations. The world had changed, and changed in a very dramatic and disturbing way. A lot of these nations were arguing, and they argued this particularly strongly in the Bandung Conference, the Afro-Asian Conference in Bandung in 1955, that they'd been disadvantaged by colonisation, they'd been economically disadvantaged, they'd been racially vilified, and that the world needed to correct its course if Asian nations were to get a fair crack of the whip. So there are a lot of arguments about economic disadvantage, a lot of arguments about systematic racial discrimination, and a lot of arguments about the need to to correct these systematically imposed disadvantages. But what Volatile Minds tended to do, or what I discovered in looking at a lot of the literature of the late 1940s, 50s and 60s, was that there was a construction of, or an understanding of what the Asian mind was, which deflected from these economic disadvantages, if you like, or from the objective study of disadvantage to the peculiarities of Asian thinking. And that took me to great texts like Biggles. Frank Clune, by the way, Frank Clune, W.E. Johns, the author of the Biggles novels, and Chairman Mao shared a birth date or a birth year. Now, make of that what you will. But I was pretty intrigued in the Biggles stories, obviously not Australian stories, but they're part of an international culture around the meaning of Asia and what being in the Asian world might mean. Biggles in the 1940s flies east. There are terrible things happening in the war. Planes that are flying out of India are being brought down as they go towards China, and no one understands what's going on. And British High Command is in a terrible fuss about this. No one can understand what's happening. So they call in Biggles, James Bigglesworth, to sort out the problem. And Biggles is known to be someone with Asian expertise. He'd grown up in India. He got to know the Indian mind as a child, and even at the age of 13, showed tremendous command and authority in India, and had quite a few people that he bossed around because that was his right and privilege to do so. He had to leave India at the age of 13 because his blood was found to be thinning. So he went to a cold climate to thicken up his blood, which was very successful. So he then returns to fly around the world, but a fair part of the world that he flies around is the Asian world. And Biggles, through these novels, is able to explain to his crew that he understands the Asian mind, and the plot of this novel spells it out. A lot of people think that the Japanese have come up with a clever new technology that will shoot planes out of the air. Biggles knows this to be wrong because the British scientists haven't thought up a technology of that kind. He knows that the Japanese are copyists and couldn't possibly invent something that the British brain had not already invented. So they're only able to copy the technologies of more advanced nations. So he poo-poos this idea and comes up with a different and I think brilliant explanation that Biggles discovers that the problem for these planes coming down is tainted chewing gum, which was a regular allocation to all flights. Only some pilots liked and chewed chewing gum, and they were the ones drugged by this dreadful means. They were the ones who crashed. Others who didn't like chewing gum, didn't eat chewing gum, were not affected. And Biggles kind of works this out, and the crew around him are astonished. And so, well, how did you know that? And how did you understand this? How do you understand the Asian mind? And Biggles said, because he had been there. He had been there. So what Biggles demonstrated was being in Asia was sufficient to demonstrate or to understand the Asian mind. And he also reveals that the mastermind behind this dreadful scheme was a gentleman called Mr. Larapindi, who is of mixed race, mysterious mixed race background. So mixed race people, Eurasian people, are deeply troubled psychologically, are not to be trusted. And Biggles also understands that as well. So the Biggles novels take you into the language of knowing Asia in the 1950s and 60s, and also understanding how the Asian mind worked. It was also, I think, so where are we now?
Cheap books, right?
Yeah, so we're onto the cheap books for Asia, which was one of the schemes introduced in the late 1950s, a favourite of Richard Gardner Casey, Dick Casey, Minister for External Affairs. He wanted books about Australia that could be published cheaply and sent into the region and would be read avidly by Asian readers, and they would come to understand that Australia was a tolerant, fair-minded nation, well disposed towards Asia, and given to thinking deeply about its place in the region. And these books would go out as little ambassadors between covers, if you like, speaking well of Australia. Across, I won't go into detail here, but across the whole period of the scheme, which lasted for about 10 years, they did not find a single book which fully expressed Australian virtues as Casey wanted them to be expressed. And one of the arguments I raise here, I think, and I've certainly persuaded myself, I don't know if I've persuaded anyone else, but one of the arguments is that Casey and his high-level bureaucrats in the Department of External Affairs were among the first Australians who had to, if you like, take off their, sorry to use the word mask, but take off their Australian mask, if you like, and put on an Asian mask as putative Asian readers. So they had to read Australian literature as they imagined an Asian reader might read this literature. So all sorts of books which seemed pretty innocent before, not that Casey or his senior public servants had read much Australian literature or writing, which I thought was also interesting. You know, the stuff that they thought would be therapeutic and beneficial to Asia was not stuff they thought they had to read themselves. But once they got into reading it, they suddenly discovered that there are all sorts of dreadful provocations, little time bombs exploding on every second page of these books about race or Aboriginal Australia or whatever it was. So part of the explanation, I think, for them not finding a book is partly that no book could possibly do all the things that Casey wanted such a book to do, but also because the idea of, again, getting to the Asian mind, the idea of Asian readers picking up these texts revealed that there were few books that you could find in Australia in the 1950s and 60s that didn't have some racialised sentiment running through them that might prove offensive to the, as I say, to this Asian reader. Not that there is such a thing, of course, but the project itself was constantly undermined and disabled by their attempt to see Australia through Asian eyes, and that attempt to see Australia through Asian eyes proved very disconcerting to them in ways that I don't think they imagined when they embarked upon that scheme. So my third section addresses the question of Asian voices. And basically what I want to argue here, or what I do argue here, is that while there were quite a few people in Australia wanting to reform immigration, there were quite a few people uneasy about the White Australia policy. There was an immigration reform movement in the late 1950s. Most of the historical emphasis has fallen upon Australia's internal efforts to reform immigration. What I propose in this third section is that from the 1950s, Australians were being exposed to increasing numbers of Asian visitors as Colombo Plan students, as fee-paying independent students from Asia, and also as visitors. There was an Asian visitors program sponsored by the government, cough. So the numbers of people coming into the country were increasing from the 1950s. These people had been rather abstractly to the Yellow Peril before the Second World War. We were not putting names to faces. We were not seeing these people. But the people coming into Australia in the 50s and 60s were often multilingual, very articulate, culturally aware, very charming and capable people. And these were the people that we were saying were unsuited to settle in Australia. And but we're also arguing that there's no racial basis for our decision making here. All these decisions are purely based around matters economic. These are economic considerations. White Australia's got nothing to do with race. It's just an economically oriented policy to maintain the Australian standard of living. So it was argued. So in come the Asian visitors. Many of them are rather perplexed by these arguments. And one of the most perplexed of them all was General Kerryappa, a very distinguished figure, the first Indian head of the Indian Army after independence. He'd fought alongside the British through the Second World War, a British trained soldier, spoke with an impeccable British accent, understood cricket, smoked Sobrani cigarettes with his own initials on them, and was a really important figure, and came to Australia as India's High Commissioner in 1953 and stayed through until 1956. Now, Kerryappa was a military man rather than a diplomat, and in 1954 he made a statement about immigration, which inflamed a tremendous controversy, because he basically suggested that Australia's immigration policy was not based around the economic considerations that were so uppermost in public rhetoric, but more about other matters. And in arguing that, he tapped the back of his hand to indicate that it was the colour of his skin, not to quote a later statement, the content of his character that was causing concern to Australians. And Kerryappa had quite a following in Australia. He had an influence on the immigration reform movement, and he was quintessentially one of these figures who you couldn't look at and say, look, this guy couldn't settle in Australia. I mean, he probably could have made the Australian cricket team, and he played polo, and he was wonderfully British in all sorts of regards. So the idea that this person was unsuited to Australian settlement was nonsense, and he argued that many Indian soldiers who'd fought alongside Britain and Australia in the Second World War would also make very good settlers, and very undiplomatically hinted that some of the settlers that Australia was taking in from the European world had actually fought against Australia in the Second World War, and why were we so neglecting our Commonwealth family? So the Kerryappa argument was really around this question of race and the Commonwealth, and why was Australia siding with the white world when it had so many friends in the Asian world who had helped us out so obviously in the Second World War. So Kerryappa, I think, was a kind of emblematic figure in making the case that a lot of the people we excluded were brilliantly well suited to Australian life had we chosen to accept them. And that was essentially his argument. Now, alongside Kerryappa was another figure that we became interested in, or my wife and I met in India, Narkadi, who came to Australia in the late 1950s. He was a farmer and came out on a Colombo plan scheme to train farmers. And I'm pleased to say that he's still alive at the age of 99 and apparently doing well. So his health regimen is something to be taken very seriously. We interviewed him for over a period of about 8 hours in Aurangabad 10 years or so ago. It's a fascinating story, the Nakedi story, which I'll just touch upon briefly. But he came out as a Colombo Plan farmer. People found him to be an exceptionally charming man. They were very interested in his spiritual practices, his yogic practices, and so on. And they asked lots of questions of him. He lived in a boarding house in Melbourne for a time. The boarding house lady, whose guest book I was able to acquire or see, was a place in which lots of Asian visitors stayed. And it was clear that Nakedi was just a charming, interesting character. And a lot of white Australians who knew nothing about, including the boarding house lady, who knew nothing about India or Indian practices, were fascinated and intrigued by this visitor. So there was a kind of chemistry about discovering a different world and an open-mindedness about discovering a different world, which was reciprocated. Nakedi was very interested in his boarding house lady, who was very bold, very outspoken, and a fascinating woman like no other woman that he would have encountered, so he said, in India. After his time in Australia, which was very successful, he travelled widely. He went back to India and, cutting a very long story short, was stitched up on a murder trial and thrown into jail, where he spent a great deal of time with two brothers on death row. When the Australians who'd known Nakedi got to hear of this, they got together petitions, they got together funding. The boarding house lady got cracking, and she went off to India to talk to Nehru about this miscarriage of justice. So a whole lot of people were mobilised in Australia to urge this man's cause upon Indian authorities. So it was a nice kind of story about reciprocal admiration, affection, in a period of white Australia. So while there were many tensions, many difficulties, much animosity, there was also a great deal of, as I say, generosity, mutual interest and reciprocity. So Australia felt, Nakedi felt enormously grateful to his Australian helpers, but his Australian helpers also felt very well disposed towards a man who taught them so much about India. So the story of Nakedi, I think, is a balancing story against the Kerryappa story, if you like, to Indian tales. Now that brings me to Stranded Nation, and why the title? Well, broadly speaking, as I'm sure you've already gathered, being very clever Blackheath History Forum people, is that in the period that I'm looking at, which is the 30s through to the 70s, Australia was caught between a rapidly receding British and European world, to which it was historically and emotionally and in other ways deeply attached. That world was receding rapidly as Asia was advancing rapidly, economically, diplomatically, politically. And Australia was caught between the two, reluctant to relinquish its British ties, its European associations, and its racial identity as expressed in the White Australia policy, but not yet well equipped in the late 60s and early 70s to understand its place in rising Asia. So we were between a rock and a hard place, the rock of British imperial attachment, if you like, and the hard place of rising Asia. And there endeth the talk.
Thank you. Thanks very much, David. That was a terrific talk. I'm just trying to get into our columns here so I can see if, yeah, okay. Just to see if we get some questions. Actually, that was a fascinating talk, and one that is not unsuited to the world in which we find ourselves today, I guess, even though I think your second book ends in about 1970. I guess the big question about all of that is, number one, we know that there are issues now with China in particular, between the US and China, Australia and China, for all sorts of complicated reasons. And it does lead me to the question about why we actually need to know about Australia's relationship with Asia. What can history tell us about what's going on today?
Thank you for the question, Margot. I think one of the reasons for looking at the history, there are at least a couple of reasons. One of them is that it's very, very interesting. Often we prescribe history as a kind of cod liver oil for the culturally ill, and that they need to take a deep draft of it in order to improve themselves. I take a very different view of history. I think it's absolutely fascinating. The stories that emerge through Anxious Nation and Stranded Nation, I think, are pretty interesting. The invasion stories, the Kerryappa story, and so on and so on. I find it absolutely fascinating and very, very engaging. But I think the other reason for looking at it is that we need to understand, I think, that for well over a century, certainly from the 1880s onwards, we've had a construction of Asia as threatening, as dangerous to Australia, as having all sorts of malign intentions towards Australia, including a desire to take over Australia or overrun Australia. And that's, as I say, that has a history going back now, where are we, 2020, 140 years, almost 150 years of anxiety about Asia's intentions towards Australia. So when we are in a situation as we're in now, where the relationship with China is very, very difficult, and China, I don't think, has helped at all in that situation. But where the relationship is very, very difficult, I think we have to be aware of the ways in which we have run very quickly and readily towards an understanding of Asia as being threatening towards Asia, that we project onto a lot of our contemporary situations a sense of threat or menace. But if we don't know that history, we don't know how persistent that's been, how deep-seated that's been, and how long we've been running this concern up the mast, and that it serves, I think, as a worthwhile reminder that we bring to these discussions certain understandings of our own about the region, which may be better understood as projections from our culture, from our cultural anxieties onto the region, and they may or may not coincide with regional realities, what's going on in China, Indonesia, Japan, or wherever. So the history, I think, apart from being fascinating and interesting in its own right, which I think it is necessary for basic cultural literacy for us. I think the Asian, I would also argue, I think, that the Asian dimension of Australian history has often been regarded as a marginal concern. It's something sitting at the edge of mainstream Australian history. And that if you want to smarten up your narrative or get a bit of colour and movement going, you bring in a bit of Asia to quicken the pace of the narrative. Whereas I would argue that actually from the late 19th century, the idea that Australia is in an Asian region, Asia Pacific region has been fundamental to our understanding of who we are and what we need to do to protect the nation. So it's not a marginal concern. I think it's helped constitute the idea of the Australian nation itself. So to understand that nation and to understand how it's historically responded to rising Asia, I think you just need to know the history.
You've spent quite a bit of time in China. One of the questions that came to my mind as I was reading your book is there an equivalent interest on a scholarly historic level from China or any other part of Asia in Australia? You know, like, is there any kind of concept of cultural history of Australia from an Asian perspective?
Well, there's certainly an interest in China. Part of the reason for being there in the chair of Australian Studies was to help support, not only to teach at Peking University, which I did, but to help support the network of Australian Studies programs across China. It may come as no surprise to learn that China has more Australian Studies than the programs and centres than the rest of the world combined. It has close to 40 Australian Studies centres. Many of them began with an understandable interest in literature and linguistics, because the people in those centres had English and were interested in literary and linguistic questions. But it subsequently broadened out to cover all the major disciplines. So in China, there is an interest in Australia that is expressed through those centres, and they have an Australian Studies conference every 2 years. Many papers are delivered at those conferences across a range of disciplines. So there is certainly an interest in that question, and the Foundation for Australian Studies in China, which is the body I was largely answerable to in my position at Peking University, also supports Chinese scholars visiting Australia, students and scholars who wish to visit Australia for research purposes. But there's also a kind of going back a bit further. One of those scholars has looked at the translation of Australian writing into Chinese in the 50s and 60s, which is pretty interesting. No Australian Studies programs then, but quite a bit of what we might think of as radical nationalist literature, Catherine Susanna Pritchard and people of that kind, were being translated into Chinese in the 1950s and 60s. So there was, if you like, a social realist, leftist literature being translated, which forms an interesting counterpoint to the cheap books program, because the Chinese had no trouble finding a lot of books to translate, which is Chinese readers will be interested in, while the Australian government found none under the cheap books program.
There's a question here from Helen Hayward Brown. She says, what do you think of Said's concept of the Occident versus Orientalism, with the Orient as the other, as exotic?
Yeah, I think the Orientalist argument has been a very powerful one, in the sense that it makes us think about how the Orient is, as Said would say, produced in our culture. And in a way, My Anxious Nation and Stranded Nation are both arguments about how we produced an Orient or an Asia for Australian purposes. And some of those purposes were to try and alert Australia to the danger it was in order for us to get bigger budgets for defence and so on. So the production of the Orient, I think, is something that runs through the Said argument and has an application to Australia. I think the Orient of Said, though, is much more the Middle East and Islam. And Australia's Asia, I think, is differently configured and differently understood and has a different regional application, I think, for us. So our Asia is much more East Asia, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. It's to an extent the Islamic world as it applies to Indonesia, but it's grown much more out of, or a lot of the fascination has grown out, or concern has grown out of our sense of vulnerability to China and Japan, and also subsequently to the potential value of those markets to Australia, particularly when Britain entered the European community in 1973, and Australia had to find its place economically in the Asian region. We had to find people who wanted to buy our stuff, and that's where Asia increasingly played into these arguments about engagement. I think the other and the final point I'll make about Orientalism, it can be a bit sweeping and Procrustean in that sometimes Asian nations are all swept into the same explanatory framework, whereas it depends a lot on whether they were colonised or not, how effectively that Orientalist argument explains their history, their culture, and their current circumstances.
Thank you. Now I have a question from Peter Robinson. Australia's search for an independent identity in the 60s and 70s seems strategically to have been absorbed into the bigger family, in inverted commas, of, for instance, Five Eyes, also the unwise Iraq adventure, in inverted commas. Comment, question mark.
Comment, question mark. Well, I think the idea of Australia, this goes to the question of whether we engage with the region and see ourselves as part of the region, or whether we stick with the family, if you like, or how the family is understood in those Anglo-Celtic terms. So it seems to me that the pull always of the Five Eyes kind of argument and the drawing back towards the communities that we know and have a historical association with is particularly compelling. And at a time, even now, where we look at the United States with a sense of gathering dismay, particularly today, perhaps. But how can we look to the United States with any sense of comfort about its reliability or predictability as a democratic nation, and what affinities and alignments do we have there? Are they fraying or dissipating? But it's also, I think, the case now, and recently, I mean, and I've been very much a person who has enjoyed the experience of working in China, of living in Beijing and working in Beijing. I'm very well disposed towards China and the Chinese people, but it's also been pretty hard. I mean, I think under Xi Jinping, China is getting harder to love than was the case even 5 or 6 years ago, when the relationship was pretty strong, actually. I mean, we were on good terms with China. Xi Jinping, as you would probably recall, addressed both houses of parliament and referred to the relationship as enduring as Uluru and as the Great Wall of China. That was, 2014 or so. So Uluru and the Great Wall of China are still looking pretty solid. The relationship rather less so. But I think there is a kind of, getting back to Peter's question, I think, is there is a kind of undertow of the old, comforting, reassuring racial identity that the Five Eyes encapsulates. And breaking free of that is pretty difficult, but at the moment being made more so, I think, by some of the legitimate concerns about China's more aggressive stance in the region.
Thanks, David. Kate O'Neill, this is one a bit out of left field, says, I was fascinated by Professor John Wong's book on the Opium Wars. Is this a time for restoring balance? I don't know the book, so perhaps you can comment.
Well, I think if I've got the drift of Paige's question, I mean, first of all, the Chinese are very conscious of their history in a way that we often don't appreciate. So that the Opium Wars have a lot of stories, a lot of TV dramas around them. You know, the point at which opium was introduced into China by the British in order to create a market, which of course was enormously damaging to the Chinese. And the unequal treaties that were signed in that period. China, from the 1840s down to 1949, saw this as a century of humiliation. This was a century of humiliation, and many atrocities were committed in China by European nations, including the burning of Yuan, which is a great old summer palace quite close to Peking University. A massive set of palaces, pavilions, gardens, and all the rest of it, which British and European forces burnt to the ground in 1860. So the Chinese kind of know that history. And if you go to Yuan now, as my wife Karen and I did quite often, it is very explicitly a monument to and a reminder of China's century of humiliation. Chinese people are being reminded that this is what happened to them when they could not defend their borders and they could not feed their people. I must add quickly that while we went there often, and we went to the information centre where they distributed material about this atrocity, we were always treated with great courtesy and great kindness. So no one in China looked at us as people who had any cultural or historic responsibility for the burning of Yuan. But it lives strongly in the memory of the Chinese. So the point, this may not be an answer to Paige's question, but I think we have to acknowledge that for the Chinese, when they make their current assertions about Chinese sovereignty, independence, and so on, it's made against a background of understanding that the Qing dynasty of the 19th, earlier, but into the 19th and early 20th century, fell apart at the seams with dreadful consequences for China and the Chinese people. They could not maintain their borders. So part of the narrative of contemporary China, I think, is to reassure the Chinese people that will never happen again. You know, that the government is strong enough and resolute enough and determined enough to guard its borders. China has 14 of them with other countries, to guard its borders and to look after its people. So I think a lot of what we see as aggression directed to the outside world, and some of it is also assuredly a set of messages being sent to the Chinese people that you will not be humiliated again.
Kate has just responded with a little comment of her own saying, British imperialism, you reap what you sow. Now, just to move away from China for a bit, I found your chapter on Indonesia very interesting. It being our, effectively our nearest neighbour, I guess, apart from PNG. Sure. And I wonder if you could just talk a bit about the relationship between Australia and Indonesia. Indonesia has almost slipped from consciousness in the current concerns about China with the pandemic and then now all the other political issues. But could you give us a bit of background on our relationship to and perceptions of Indonesia?
Yes, the chapter actually focuses on the visit of the first Minister for External Affairs from any country or foreign affairs to Australia, and that was Dr. Subandrio in 1959. I think it was 1959. And Subandrio was an extremely suave, articulate, educated Indonesian, and many Australians didn't think such a person existed, frankly, and Frank Clune being among them. So Australians were confronted by, if you like, a new independent Indonesia came to the fore in a figure like Subandrio. I call the chapter Oriental Blandishments because, again, it brought up so many of those Fu Manchu representations, the clever Oriental who can run rings around the flat-footed European. So part of the story was about the West New Guinea dispute, or East Irian. Australia in that time was still supporting the Dutch, so it's still clinging, getting back to the Five Eyes observation. Australia was clinging pretty desperately to the Dutch as having a rightful place in West New Guinea or East Irian, and did so in the belief that that would they'd be a more secure neighbour than untrustworthy Indonesia. So that had us clinging on to an imperial relic, if you like, or an imperial relic or a European relic, well beyond the point that should have happened, and we eventually gave up on that in 1963. But the relationship with Indonesia, I mean, it's interesting if you compare it to the China relationship. I mean, China's had and Japan up to a point. Japan and China have had a front and centre place in our imaginary, I think, partly because we felt that they threatened us directly with invasion, and that from the late 19th century, that's how they were understood. So you have to take notice. You have to take notice of them in a way that you didn't have to take notice of the individual of the Indonesians. And I think a lot of that sort of tropical argument comes into play there as well. That East Asia, and especially if you've been in Harbin in winter, as we have, when the temperature can get to -40, this is a cold climate people. They have aptitudes and exceptionally large brains. So, so the idea that they can be dismissed on those old racial grounds is not very convincing. Whereas kind of Indonesia, there was often that tropical lassitude argument running around them, that they're not well organised, that they couldn't get themselves together, they can't possibly invade. And then along comes the Confrontasi and all the rest of it, and we get the F-111 partly to protect us against Indonesia. But an Indonesian threat has never been seen as quite so convincing or quite so menacing as it has from East Asia. India similarly. I mean, we've never thought of India as invasive in the way that we think of Japan and China as potentially invasive. With Indonesia, it's also interesting, I think, and if you go back to the Subandrio story, Subandrio said that Australia often thought about Asia as if there was a blank space where Indonesia was. You know, we just didn't see the region. We didn't see that part of the world at all. It just wasn't there. And his contention was that Australians perhaps had to recognise that it was, that Indonesia was not only there, but extremely close to Australia. And the two countries had to had to work together. But the relationship has always been pretty difficult. I remember at the time, I can't remember exactly when it was, but at the point at which there were all sorts of difficulties with the Indonesian government, because I think Suharto's finances were under scrutiny by the Australian newspaper, and travel to Bali was banned. And a lot of Australians became extremely indignant about this, because what did Bali have to do with Indonesia? You know, we kind of didn't know, many of us, that Bali has some relationship to Indonesia, and indeed is thought by the Indonesians, wrongly of course, as part of Indonesia. So I think we've always had a bit of a problem understanding Indonesia and kind of knowing what Indonesia is and where Indonesia's headed. So it's always been a kind of troubled region in terms of our intellectual engagement with Indonesia, I think, and understanding Indonesia and the region. Complicated, of course, by it being a large Islamic society.
Yeah, it is a very challenging place to just lob into as a gawky Australian. There's a hell of a lot going on there that is fairly, incomprehensible if you just land in Jakarta and try and work out how the place works and all of that. That brings me to another.
Oh, I was just going to add one thing there, Margot,
yes,
and that is
please do.
I had an interest in and an involvement in establishing an Australian studies program in Indonesia, which was quite successful for a time at Universitas Indonesia in Jakarta. It was a pretty difficult program to keep running, and whereas we have that large program in China, troubled though the relationship is, it's been really hard to get a secure and robust Australian studies program in Indonesia. On the face of it, you'd think that would make a lot of sense.
Well, that leads me to where I was going with the next question, really, is that, quite obviously it's often trade and trade opportunities that promotes these relationships and encourages a more sophisticated understanding of different cultures and countries and different cultural practices and so on. The chapter in your book on trade I found most interesting because it gives the lie to capitalism, or trade, put more simply, being a rational process, that it was what you describe is completely irrational, with some exceptions, but I guess it's proved to be a lot more rational, if you'd like to put it that way now. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk a bit about the content of that chapter, just to give the audience a bit of an idea about the sorts of things that you unearthed.
Yeah, it's a rare person that finds a chapter on trade fascinating, Margot. Yeah, so I do think
it's fascinating.
Yeah. No, it is. I find it pretty interesting as well. I forgot to mention one of the images in the slide was the frog flower. Yeah. That was one of Australia's exports to the region. I'm interested in the trade side of the argument, but I'm also interested in the cultural penumbra that sits around trade, if you like. So trade sits within a cultural framework, and looking at the trading relationship with the region, there were quite a few people who, by the 1940s certainly, and in fact we'd had quite a strong trade with Japan in the 1930s through the Depression. Japan had bought a lot of Australian wool and had helped us out of the Depression. So there was a precedent for trade with Asia being beneficial to Australia. That argument built up again in the late 1940s. But what was interesting in looking at the trade argument was the ways in which certain understandings, and it goes also to the Asian mind question, certain understandings of Asia and the Asian mind influenced decision making about trade. That is, that people wouldn't be able to respond to more sophisticated Australian products, that they needed some pretty basic products. A lot of the advertising, and going back to frog flour, a lot of the advertising was very poorly conceived as well, because a lot of people in Indonesia, for example, weren't happy with the idea of flour made from frogs. You know, they'd often associate a bird or an animal imagery with the content of the product that was being sold. So there were all sorts of disputes about marketing, about how issues were being, or how products were being badged. But there was a constant theme running through that, if I remember the chapter as well as you do, Margot, and maybe I don't. But there was a constant theme running through it that anything would do for Asia. We didn't really have to put a lot of thought into that market, that any old stuff would do. So while at a rhetorical level, there were quite a few people saying this really matters to us, at an on-the-ground level, there was often a contempt for Asian markets, or a contempt for the people that they had to deal with, an unwillingness to accept the possibilities of trade with the region, and also an unwillingness to do research into products and product placement. And one of the things that comes through, even in the 1950s and 60s, is that while the Americans, who we all know are tremendously fanatical about this kind of thing, were kind of working out the psychology of the customer and all the rest of it, and working out what people needed, we tended to have a lofty contempt for that kind of, zealotry, and just thought that this market could look after itself. You know, we didn't have to think about it a whole lot. The other thing that emerged in the course of that chapter was how the differences in the status or the appearance of the embassies, if you like, and there's a lot of commentary about our embassy in Jakarta, which, so at the time that we're talking about the importance of a close relationship, the embassy in Jakarta was a very, very shoddy affair. You know, that if they turned on the radio, the lights went out. If they turned on the lights, the radio went off. And, you know, they had buckets and leaking ceilings. And the Indonesians were very derogatory about the shabby makeshift status of the Australian embassy. Whereas in Britain and Washington, our embassies were very posh affairs, and a lot of money was being spent on them. So there was a sense, I think, that, okay, these are important and emerging markets, but we don't have to give a hell of a lot of thought. We don't have to give much thought to them because pretty much anything will do. You know, anything will do for the any old stuff will do for the natives.
Yes, anyway, I found it very entertaining. Now we're getting close to wind up time. I do have another question, which I think is probably quite an important one to deal with, and that is the way in which the Australian government represented Aboriginal people to Asia. I think especially in the 50s and 60s. Those Aboriginal Indigenous Australians have been largely absent from our discussion today. But those perceptions of our European relationships with Indigenous people were very important.
Yes.
Sorry, got interference here.
Thank you for that excellent question, Margot. The argument I run here is that from the 1930s, there were people beginning to realise that if Australia wanted to get closer to the region, if Australia wanted to have a role in the region, it did have a bit of a problem, and that little problem was called the White Australia policy. You know, that we had a policy of restrictive immigration, discriminatory immigration, and that was not necessarily helpful in friendship and hospitality. So we had a kind of contradictory position or predicament in that from the late 1940s as independent, decolonising Asia is producing independent and much more outspoken nations, particularly India. They're becoming increasingly critical of Australia's immigration policy on racial grounds. And some of the critics are turning their attention towards the status, the lowly status of Aboriginal Australians and the circumstances in which they're living. And they're saying that Australia's protestations that it's a tolerant nation, which were common for the 1950s and 60s, and the idea that we had no racial prejudice, which was common for the 1950s and 60s, was hardly reflected in the treatment and circumstances of Aboriginal Australians, Indigenous Australians. So the message went out from the Department of External Affairs to all embassies and posts that this question about the status of Aboriginal Australia, A, had to be avoided if at all possible. So if you could avoid the question about what was going on in Indigenous Australia, please do so. If it became unavoidable, if you had to talk about it, then what you had to say was this, and there were a number of directives and instructions on how this question was to be tackled. But the basic response was that Aboriginal Australians were a people so primitive, so backward, so locked into the Stone Age and so incapable of adapting to the modern world that their status had nothing to do with mainstream white Australian attitudes, nothing to do with white Australia policies, nothing to do with discrimination or racial antipathy, but had everything to do with them. That is, their Stone Age and primitive condition. So the argument then became white Australia was doing its level best to improve the conditions and living circumstances of these unfortunate people who were so maladapted to the modern world, with the, in brackets, argument, please don't blame us for the circumstances in which you may find them. It's got everything to do with their primitive status and nothing to do with our racial attitudes. So through the 50s and 60s, there was a pretty insistent message running out through the Department of External Affairs, through its offshoot magazine Hemisphere, which was published from the late 1950s and went out to all Asian posts and Asian students, through Radio Australia, which was also effectively an arm of the Department of External Affairs, that Aboriginal Australians were too primitive to adapt to the modern world, and that their adverse circumstances were not to be looked upon as being something that Australia could be criticised for.
Thank you for that, David. I think we're going to let you off the hook now. We've been talking, and you in particular have been talking for a very long time. We really appreciate your giving us the time today. I found it, I found the books and the talk extremely interesting. I should mention to our audience there is also an interview with David on Richard Fidler's Conversations program, which is online. You can look it up and listen to the podcast on the ABC. There's more personal content, I guess, in that about your experiences in China and other things. So I commend it to people also. I think that took place last year. Was it 2019 after the second book came out? So look that up. I want to thank Emily O'Gorman, who is behind the scenes managing all the technical side of everything today, which, without that, we couldn't do these presentations. So, Emily, thank you very much. She is a member of our committee, quite well known to the Blackheath audience. I want to also mention that our next online presentation will be on the 17th of October at 4 o'clock, and where Professor Lynette Russell will be talking about her most recent book, which was co-authored with zoologist Penny Olsen. That's a rather unusual conjunction of disciplines and authors. The book is titled Australia's First Naturalists, Indigenous Peoples' Contribution to Early Zoology, and it's about interactions between Indigenous and European people on that subject. In her talk, Penny will reflect on the way in which interdisciplinary work between historians and scientists of various kinds allows a very nuanced picture of the past. So we look forward to meeting up with you all again then. And David, thanks and goodbye.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Emily.
Our pleasure. Bye now.